Hi, everyone. Welcome to this episode of the Charity Charge Show. I'm your host, Stephen Garten. Today, I am so excited to have on Marnie Webb, who is the CEO of TechSoup. Marnie, thank you so much for being with us today on the Charity Charge Show.
Super happy to be here. Thanks a lot for asking me.
Absolutely. I'm very excited about this episode because I love the mission of TechSoup. When I started Charity Charge, I didn't have a formal background, really much experience other than being a volunteer of different nonprofit organizations, and came up with this idea how we started with our consumer card to help organizations fundraise more. Obviously, changed over the years as we evolved to working directly with nonprofit organizations. And what I've seen over the past decade has really blown my mind. From a statistics perspective, roughly, and correct me if I'm wrong on any of these numbers, approximately 95% of all nonprofit organizations are under $1 million in revenue. What I saw firsthand growing up being a volunteer, and my high school even had us do a lot of different volunteer opportunities locally in the Baltimore area. And then moving to Austin, as I was engaged with local nonprofit organizations, the direct impact that they're able to make. And across the country, the 95% of these organizations that are under a million know who they're trying to serve so well. They are deeply, deeply passionate about those people, but yet they're not the household brand names when you think about the nonprofit sector of a March of Dimes, American Cancer Society, some of these big brand name organizations, but they're unbelievably vital to our sector, right? It's not different than uh, obviously there's huge corporations. People might think of Meta or Google or Tesla or other big companies, Coca-Cola, American Airlines, et cetera. But it really comes back to the small to medium sized businesses that drive the economy. So there's this interesting parallel for nonprofit organizations. So I'm curious for you to talk about that, and how does that map to really the role that TechSoup plays?
Yeah. So, as you know, of course, TechSoup provides support to other nonprofit organizations around the world as they use a wide variety of technology to achieve their missions. I think it's important to note that it's not just the technical part of administering the tools, but it's also how do you present your organizations in a digital world? How do you know that you're not sharing mis and disinformation with the people you serve? How do you make sure that your website shows a legitimate organization and is connected to a secure donation platform to give donors comfort giving to you? How do you make choices about the wide variety of artificial intelligence tools that are coming at organizations, right? So it's that whole spectrum. How do I as an organization, how might I play out my values and the tools that I choose? How do I actually adopt and administer those tools? But then how do I use those tools as a part of what I am doing to connect with the people I serve, with my donors, with funders, and everything else? So when you're talking about these organizations that are under $1 million, they don't have the money to just hire that advice in-house. Like we would love to get to a day where every nonprofit organization has the same amount of funding for their technology as a well-funded startup does. But we're nowhere close to that. And yet, as you point out, these organizations are doing vital things in their community. So one of my colleagues at TechSoup was just sharing a story about a small organization with whom she volunteers, and their whole purpose to exist is to get students to art classes. That there's this place in her town that offers art classes. They give a scholarship, but there are a lot of students that can't get from their school or their home to the class. So this nonprofit is doing this one thing, but it's so vital for those students and for this bigger system. And you know what she was pointing out when she was telling sharing this story was that it's an example of what these nonprofits can do that's so powerful, which is build trust at the local level. Because you trust people you ask for help from people and you can recognize need at that hyper-local level. And that's what these small organizations can do. They can recognize need, they can build relationships, and they can help support people in accessing the other resources that may be available to them, as well as bring more resources themselves, of course. And I think that's vitally important to helping ensure that we keep open the spaces in which everyone in our communities has an opportunity to thrive.
Thank you for sharing that. And to give context too for this, which is going to kind of hopefully come out of this next question, is At Charity Charge, we work with about 3,000 organizations. And this episode, I think, is so critical because we want to be able to provide them with knowledge, access to tools, learnings, things that can actually help them run their organizations more efficiently. And even when we talk about the $1 million under, I might be again off a little bit, but directionally I'll be there. I think that 75% of all nonprofit organizations are under $250,000 in revenue. So these are organizations that maybe have one or two full-time employees. A lot of them are obviously volunteer led. They're started for a very specific need, as you point out, this organization that's helping solve the gap of rides to the art school in their local community, but they might just be completely volunteer led. They don't understand how to actually do all the behind the scenes, how to save money, how to grow their organization efficiently. So really what I'm curious is, where I think this is also relevant is in the nonprofit industry, just like the for-profit industry, you always have business creation and business, I guess you could call it destruction. In other words, nonprofits that are started every year and nonprofits that go out of business. So TechSoup, from my perspective, being in the nonprofit world, is one of the household brands. But there might be individuals that are running or connected to nonprofits that don't know about it. Can you give some of the backstory of how TechSoup was started and then also share whatever would be relevant impact metrics or just kind of the type of results that TechSoup has been able to grow into? Because it's quite impressive. And I think it's really important that everyone listening to this would go to TechSoup.org and figure out how it can benefit their organization.
Yeah, absolutely, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to answer that. So TechSoup was started in 1987 by a journalist who noticed that nonprofits need support, and he had all the been using technology. They just needed advice, and mentorship. So it was started under the name CompuMentor, where he connected volunteers, with nonprofit organizations to just help them think through what they needed from technology. That grew as his journalist friends started getting floppy disks, the square hard ones,
Yeah, I do remember those.
Right, right. So floppy disks to review software, and then they were destroying those floppy disks. And Daniel Ben Horn was like, hang on a second, give those to me. I can redistribute those floppy disks to nonprofit organizations. That grew with a gift from Microsoft of product, also on floppy disks, to distribute to nonprofit organizations. And then, the hard work of hundreds of individuals that have worked for TechSoup over time, hundreds of individuals that worked in our partner organization, supported us with support from companies like Microsoft, very notably, actually, in those early years, particularly, and foundations and the nonprofits that we work with. We defined what a nonprofit looks like in 234 countries and territories around the world so that we could help distribute you know, those floppy disks to validated nonprofits and help corporations grow a donation program. That was while the work of figuring it out was funded by grants, the day-to-day operations was actually funded by the nonprofits themselves who valued the service. And every time they paid us a fee, they weren't paying for that product, which was donated. They were paying for us to write articles about how to use the product, for us to set up programming to support them when they ran into troubles, for us to run forums and do all those things. And over time, that product went from being on floppy disks to being on CDs to being downloaded and now to being something you connect to and don't. And so the big change that we've seen is what advice means in that changing and accelerating technology environment. If at first our advice was really focused a lot on acquisition and getting it from that disk to your hard drive, and which drivers do I need and how do I connect to my printer again and what is this internet and do I really need a web page? All of that kind of stuff that was really focused on access and preparing for digitalization, and then we sort of had COVID and that slammed organizations into genuine digital transformations because before they could go, we'll make everything digital tomorrow. And then all of a sudden they're working from home and doing everything over their laptops and an internet connection. And so they had to make the change to today where organizations get a product once and then they don't decide to get it again. You don't get Zoom again. Not really. You pay for it year over year, but it doesn't, your cycle of paying for it and deciding to keep Zoom and continue to use Zoom is not connected with their cycle of innovation and changing the product. So the product can change because it's Thursday, and they released a new feature into the product. And so that disconnect between understanding the product and acquiring it has been significant for us and for nonprofits. And I think what we would love organizations to turn, we'd love it if they started with TechSoup to help give them the guidance and support so that they can access, adopt, and optimize technology to meet their needs and in ways that are mission aligned and within the constraints of the resources they have available, which is both time and money. I will say that I think it's really helpful not to think in terms of budget when we think about these organizations, but think in terms of staff. Think in terms of 5 or fewer staff when we're talking about 1 million or under, because that budget can be used for a variety of things, like if it's a food bank, supporting getting food to people. And sometimes the food shows up on the budget. So the organization may look much bigger because it has these goods in their budget that they're actually giving away. Or they may be doing other things with their budget, like providing shelter to domestic violence survivors. So I think holding this idea, and then of course, in different economies, $1 million may be a big, maybe a medium sized organization in a different economy. And so I think it's really helpful to think of this spot of organizations as having 5 or fewer full-time employees, which means they are probably getting technology advice from a variety of people and AI robot friends, and the corporations that are also selling them the technology tools or donating to them the technology tools that they're using. So they're trying to package together advice about how to use technology from a wide variety of perspectives. And I think what we bring is our perspective is shared. We're a nonprofit organization too. We may be bigger, we may have a bigger budget. I may have people internally I can ask for tech support from, but we still are operating within the same constraints. We know a restricted grant means I can't use that money to pay for technology unless the funder said I could use that money to pay for technology. And so we help work within those constraints, and I think can give better advice because of it.
And on a very practical level, for someone, say a board member that's listening to this episode and they're running an organization that has one employee and a handful of board members and they're $150,000 in revenue. Part of the model, like the value add for them, and I get that there's a variety of areas, obviously, as TechSoup has grown. How I look at it is they can join TechSoup, and TechSoup's already done sort of, I don't know what you would term it, but the effort to negotiate discounts on a wide variety of software, hardware, and other partnerships so they can basically unlock all of this value across a wide variety of categories and help that organization find vetted great tools and software and hardware, and also save money accessing those top discounts. is
Yeah.
that is
Yeah.
that more on kind of a practical level? If
Yes and no. So certainly we work to try and negotiate donations and discounts on behalf of the nonprofit sector, and that's an accurate description of what we have historically done in this area. However, it's changing. Many corporations are doing the managing the product donations themselves. AI and open government databases have dramatically changed what it means to how hard it is to know whether somebody is or is it not a nonprofit and to be able to provide support to them. So we see, the work that we've done over these 40 years has helped to organize this market so that it's addressable. And so we do see for-profit competitors coming into the space and providing some of the services that you're talking about. So it's not just us. They can get donations and discounts from a wide variety of places. If they go straight to Google, they're going to get one on that page. That has nothing to do with TechSoup, in any part of it. And so, that's good and bad, right? It's great because there are more options for corporations and those that wish to give to organizations. On the other hand, it's putting a burden back on the organizations to go through and make decisions about which technology is best for them. So, when I think about that, I think that the challenge that we have to address is say, well, how do we bring those things together so that organizations can see what's available to them, what they're eligible for, and have ways to compare it so that they can make the best decisions about acquiring their technology. And in those cases, absolutely still starting with us, but it's not always because we've been the one that negotiated the donation or discount.
Got it. Excellent. Talk to us also. A lot of the value that you bring are around courses, online training programs, and your peer to peer community and discussion groups. Can you talk about how those were created and sort of the history of TechSoup, where the organization saw the need for that.
Yeah, but one of my biggest frustrations is when we start thinking about that as a separate thing from offering advice and support to the organization. I think it's something we've struggled with. So we started with it like many other people when online learning started to be genuinely accessible and platforms lowered in costs. It was an opportunity for us to provide resources to people so they could learn things that are more specific to nonprofit organizations. It's different to use Excel or Google Sheets to run an inventory for a food pantry. We could give them examples that were their examples, not just every example. But the point always has to be that we're fitting it into their ability to use technology inside an organization, right? So the thing that we're always leaning against is not just to learn Excel so that I can learn Excel or to learn how to make, use Chat GPT or develop a, Google Gem inside of Gemini and be able to use it to write something. Of course, people want to know that, but what are the ways that you use it as an organization that may be different from the ways that somebody else uses it? Email, not much different, frankly. You don't need a lot of specialized training on email. Spreadsheets, a little different, not a lot different. AI, potentially a lot different, right? So, how do we lean into those things where the education may be lacking for nonprofit organizations because the way that they would integrate it into their workflow, the values they might bring to thinking about it, and the tooling that's actually available may or may not fit with them as well as it does in some for-profit markets. So how do we use a wide variety of learning opportunities to support organizations in being able to use it? So if you imagine that life cycle of, somebody's deciding whether or not to get a piece of technology, awesome. We can help compare that. It doesn't matter where they get it. We can still help them think about which one is right for them. The second one is adopting it. There's a lot of tech in there, but there's also a lot of training for a staff because you can have an awesome admin that sets something up. But if your team of the 4 other people, your board members, your volunteers don't know how to use that, it doesn't get adopted, right? It doesn't get genuinely used. It's just sitting there. And then optimizing it. So for us, what does that mean? That means when a new feature comes out inside the product that everybody knows how to use and has been using now for a long time and they're really happy and now it's got a bunch of new features in it. How do you support them knowing how and where to use those new features? So we really think of education as being fitting into that process, right? Rather than standing independent of that. There's a lot of great education that does stand independent of that. That's for an individual looking to grow their skills or their career. Right? There's a lot of wonderful, wonderful content available in a wide variety of places, but we're really leaning against the place where it's growing their ability to use a technology as a part of a team, right? So that they can make a change inside of their organization because it's the health of that organization that we are hyper focused on. When we think about community, so that's how we think that learning journey fits into that overall journey of use and adoption and optimization of technology within an organization. And when we think of the collective and community, I think it's what we have to use as a sector-wide superpower to lower the cost of actually being able to adopt stuff. Most of us can't afford to join professional associations of our peers. We don't always travel to conferences. I mean, I'm super lucky. I do get to travel to conferences. And so I was just at one we held in Sarajevo, actually, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, that was bringing together digital activists from the Western Balkans and a broader region to share how they're using how they're thinking about digital security, how they're thinking about AI. That ability to learn from other people in a room is tremendous, but you can't support that all the time and you can't support that for everyone. So how do we bring that together in sort of adoption or learning circles? Sector resilience doesn't, in the for-profit world, you read a lot about moats. The moat a company digs around themselves that is uncrossable, right? So that they protect themselves. I think and that's where resilience comes from, like historically, you might read about Microsoft's moat being its reseller network.
Mhm.
People that can implement Microsoft tools, right? And how much people know about the technology and the network of consultants that work with it. I think for nonprofits, we don't have a moat, we have bridges.
Mm.
Have to be building connections across to our little castles so that people and ideas and tools and data can flow, and we have the opportunity to coordinate with the same level of sophistication as the challenges that we're facing.
I had a I love how you shared all of that. I had some other questions prepared, but now I want to go down this path. This is
Let's
always
do
where
it. Let's do it.
the podcast can be really fun. So I just want to highlight some stats, and we'll get back to where you were just going down. But TechSoup's impact: 234 countries and territories, 39 languages supported, 1.44 million nonprofits, charities, and libraries served, almost $22 billion in technology and financial resources delivered. The scale at which you're doing this is unbelievable. Even for myself, I always just think of the US nonprofit sector, right? You're talking about, just being at a conference, nonprofit focused, at least conference in Sarajevo. What are the things to if you kind of reflect on the global perspective of nonprofits at large, what are the similarities and what are some of the differences that you see? You can answer it in a variety of ways, whatever comes top of mind. I'm thinking about it from the perspective of obviously macro, like it could be the nonprofit industry as a whole, like country by country, but also from the mindset of who you're serving, right? The people that are at that organization that is providing the transportation for the kids to get to art class, right? And their day to day struggles. How does that differ from, leader or board members from country to country?
Yeah. So I don't know, you see people that are passionate across the board. You see people that are passionate about their mission that sometimes have been personally affected by things within their mission area. And that's part of what brought them to work in and for the nonprofit they're working or starting the initiative that they're starting. That is universal. The constraints of government recognition and funding are universal. So, to get a grant from a foundation, need to have a certain recognition from your government. What starts to change is how dangerous or safe that is in different places. And there you see a spectrum, The United States, we have often thought of ourselves as pretty safe to, be a nonprofit, but that changes, and it changes for different kinds of nonprofit organizations, and there can be different efforts against nonprofit organizations. And so certainly there are lessons learned, that you can see from people that have been farther ahead in different parts of the overall journey of government recognition or the closing down of spaces in which civil society worked. I was at an event not too long ago with somebody that mentioned casually as if it were no big deal that he was part of the team that wrote into, I think it was the Czech Republic's constitution, what it means to be a nonprofit organization. So that's a place where he was saying, okay, we've learned this thing in the United States that we can apply here to a society or a government that's opening up and wants to be able to recognize this as a kind of organization. On the other hand, many of us are looking now at Viktor Orban's Hungary as a country that's further ahead on being oppressive
Hmm.
and in reducing the space in which civil society organizations can operate. And we need to learn from those lessons too, because civil society successfully resists that. Look at what students did in Serbia, blockading the universities to create change in their government. So that kind of change happens in all kinds of places. I think what we have to do and what's hard is to help people not just look at it and go, wow, that's an awesome, inspirational slash sad slash, whatever the story is, and say, how do we present those? I think this is part of our job at TechSoup. And we were the conference I was just at, I should say, we were the host of, with support from foundations and others, and as a regular event that we do called Megaphone. But that, part of our job is taking those stories and say, okay, how do we make them actionable, and how do we put them in front of people at the right time so it's meaningful to them? And the lessons apply to them.
How do you, when you were also talking about, related to some of the really interesting points you've been sharing, you were comparing moats, not building a moat rather, but building a bridge. That sounds great. What's been interesting from my perspective, and I think I need to get more perspective, and that's part of chatting with you, of course, right? And other leaders through this podcast, is the amount of scarcity mindset that I've seen from nonprofit organizations that are worried about obviously funding and other ways they're trying to grow their organizations, and the unwillingness to cooperate or partner up
Yeah.
with organizations in their community.
Yeah.
The bridges, it sounds great on the whole. It does feel that it could be 1 + 1 = 3. Can you talk about that? And also,
Yeah.
it's your maybe part of it's your aspirational vision for how the nonprofit world can be better and society can be better. Maybe some success stories that you have seen, but then also the challenges and also how you might challenge a person at an organization to potentially think differently about building bridges instead of moats at their
Yeah.
organization.
Yeah, I think it's hard, because when you get into a scarcity mindset and there's a moment where you're thinking about organizational survival, you're in competition. None of us are putting grants in knowing we all know that the pie is finite when we submit a grant and somebody is going to lose that grant and somebody is going to win that grant. And that's a very real set of dynamics in the sector. And I would not want to gloss over that or pretend like that element of competition doesn't exist. Of course it does. But we are facing huge interconnected challenges right now in the world. Migration, climate change, food insecurity, violence, gender-based violence, right? Those things come together. We have organizations working on that. We have to look at and invest in, as a sector, some of the tools that allow us to coordinate. Some of those can be super geeky, which I'm happy to do faster than anybody else actually wants me to. And they're things like data standards and efforts like our own data commons or data commons that Giving Tuesday has put up so that you can go in and you can interrogate the data and help see the intersectionality of this data, and that you can provide data standards so these organizations have ways to communicate with each other, right? That's super geeky, super standards based. It's like, the specs for the bridge, so that we can
Like that. Yeah.
all be guaranteed that it's like going to work while we're trying to cross it and it's not going to collapse.
Everyone's using the same unit of measurement,
Yeah,
right?
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly, right? And, where I live in California, we saw a horrible example of that not working when there were fires in the Oakland Hills, and the San Francisco Fire Department rushed to support the response, and their hoses did not fit on the fire hydrants in Oakland because they had different specs, right? So that's what we gotta solve for, that kind of problem, and that has to happen not because the small organizations we help do it. That can't be their burden. They have enough burdens. That's gotta be something that gets solved because infrastructure organizations like us and Candid and Tech Impact and Giving Tuesday and Global Giving and Every.org and every other infrastructure organization that you can think of to name come together and use the same standards that are supported by foundations, and that we're taking on that work as intermediaries to make sure all the bridges have the same specs and we can all depend on them and the boats can sail under them and all the other things that you do when you set up that kind of a system. So I think we need genuine investment in, public good technology infrastructure and digital public goods. Where I've seen it work, we have a couple of projects where I've seen it work. One that we're working on right now in San Diego County, supported by the San Diego County District Attorney, that supported by that office to build out tooling to help frontline workers more quickly find shelter for community members that are experiencing homelessness, right? And that's a place where we all know it's under siege. There are more people that are without shelter than there are available spaces in shelter. And yet sometimes the space may go unused because the person that fits it wasn't found. So a common tooling and a common set of standards can help better work together to more quickly find space, but also find out where they need to build more space. If really we just need more bottom bunks in the world because not enough people can climb up onto the top bunk
Mhm.
to spend the night. Awesome. That's great information for the, County of San Diego to have when they're thinking about how they're funding and building shelter space. If we need more places that have big lockers, because if I've lost everything in my home, I don't want to give up my stuff or trust it to some big cage that's way over there away from me. I want a locker at the foot of my bed. Awesome. Let's invest in that. So at those common systems don't just give the teams the ability to work. It allows you to advocate for what's missing. And I think those are places where we see some success. I mean, the Giving Tuesday movement, we have Giving Tuesday coming up December 2nd, right? And that's another place where you've seen some success, right? The whole of civil society has agreed that we're going to use this day to help catalyze remarkable generosity. And I've done research that indicates that giving to one organization doesn't make you go, done now. It actually makes you give more and to more organizations. And so that is the kind of I think that's also a great example where we've built bridges.
What's your sense? It's related to this kind of theme, but if you look at nonprofit foundations, I need to do my maybe some of the backstory on the laws and how it's set up. But foundations currently have to gift away 5% of their assets on the average of the prior 3 years. You were holding your up. What was
I
your
think it's actually 4%, but you might be right, it might be 5.
What's your sense of the role? Like when we think about these are some general, but I always love looking at the Giving USA report, which is a snapshot. Well, it's more than a snapshot. It's an exhaustive report, but then they always, kind of snapshot the overall trends. I think we're still at somewhere around 2/3, 66% or so of support to nonprofit organizations comes from individuals. And then you also see about, I believe it's 11% from foundations, and the rest is made. Then there's corporations, which could be at the 23%. And then I think the rest is sort of an other and like bequests type of.
Legacy.
What does that kind of data show you? Right. And how do you also think it might change as someone is starting a nonprofit, how they should think about, the startup phase of initially trying to prove out what they're doing, be able to grow, be able to get to that next level. And then how does organizations as they mature, should they be thinking about funding in the context of those statistics?
Yeah, I have sort of 3 general one, this is not my or area of expertise, so I don't wanna pretend like it is, but I have 3 general reactions to it. One, I'm not sure how valuable some of those statistics are right now because we're in the midst of such a big upheaval of funding and how funding works and so much fear about how funding works. And a lot of that's been, some of the changes with the US government has been most, like, talked about, but we see those changes in other countries all the time. They're just not as big a swing, but pulling USAID and State Department money out of, some nonprofits has been significant to nonprofits all over the world and in all kinds of locations, being able to operate in private philanthropy, whether it comes from individuals or foundations, are not sufficient to fill that gap. I think, so that's one thing. It makes it those statistics I think are just going to change tremendously. Two, anytime you have any regime, any place in the world sort of starts clamping down on civil society a little bit, there can be a chilling effect on giving because givers don't wanna be caught in on that, right? And that again happens worldwide. So you have governments that change priorities. Historically, funding for healthcare outside of the United States has always swung since Reagan's when you've had a Republican or Democratic president, So you have those kinds of changes that happen over time, that happen in any government. You can have a chilling effect in some countries on individual giving because of legal changes or just fear or whatever else that can come with changes. Um, but the third thing I think that is persistent that we just have in this country, I believe, outsourced an unreasonable burden to the generosity and human power, few under-resourced individuals relative to the size of the problem. So when people are working in the United States on food security, working on a problem the market has solved for 80% of the humans in the United States. We can get in our cars or get public transportation, and get to a grocery store. We can afford the food when we get to the grocery store. We can bring it home, have a kitchen to cook it in. So I can make a variety of from ready-made to completely fresh ingredients that I can work with. And but nonprofits are helping people that can't access that system. Maybe they don't have a home to cook it in. Maybe they don't have a grocery store close enough to go to. Maybe they don't have the money to be able to afford groceries whenever they get into that store. So we've outsourced a problem that the for-profit markets can't solve to nonprofits. And then we say, why aren't you more nonprofit with with meager philanthropy to meet that need? Relative size of the problem. And then we're going to add other problems on top of it. Maybe some of those individuals that can't get food are also survivors of human trafficking. Maybe they're youth that escaped their home. Maybe they're people that don't speak, the language of the community they're located in. And we're gonna make those problems more complex because there's probably some other issue in there as well.
Hmm.
Maybe they're in a town where the only food available is at a dollar store. So we're going to continue to make it worse. And I think when we think about the problem like that, we can't just think about these passionate individuals that are coming together and memorializing the desire for change by creating a nonprofit organization to work on an issue that they care about. We have to say, how are we better setting up structures to help you and let you do that and keep going? And I think some of it is having better ways to share the burden of overhead in ways that traditionally unions have done for workers, so that we're negotiating for groups of people and you stop that back and forth fighting quite so much. And some of that, I think, has to happen because we recognize a variety of forms of generosity, and make it more accessible to everyday humans. The stats that you're talking about with giving are probably from the IRS, which means it's only capturing people that benefit from tax break from giving. There's a lot of other thing that happens in our communities, and happens in our churches and doesn't show up on those forms. And I think to really understand the magnitude of the problem, we have to be prepared to look at that. I think that's a lot of the stuff that's in Giving Tuesday's Data Commons to help us understand. So I think there's a part that it's like almost this pressure of efficiency placed on organizations that are helping people that couldn't be helped by the efficient for-profit market systems that exist. I think we have to have different ways of thinking about how we fund and support them. That's not just based on money, but is systemic.
Thank you for sharing all of that. That opens up my eyes, obviously, to dig deeper, right? And not just take, data and metrics at face value. There's so many things that you just unpacked there that I'm excited to listen to this episode myself. And again, like just sit back as an observer of it, because kind of opened my eyes to even, and not for like ego purposes, but I just think of over the years, yeah, so many little extra things that I've done locally that I didn't file it on my tax. Whether that was like in-kind donations or it was showing up to volunteer or whatever it might have been, that can be misleading as well from the data. And then something that, I could go on and on with you about. It's so interesting as you talk about it, you kind of share the parallel of the union's perspective, right? Don't know that I could say there's not enough advocacy and cumulative come togetherness and in ways that actually help uplift the whole sector and also the employees at these organizations that are, you know, uh, quite frankly, overworked and underpaid,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And we need more of those things. And it happens. I'm not. I haven't gone. I'm familiar with organizations like National Council of Nonprofits and the state associations, but I've always thought of like who really, you know, I guess it's a matter of, them collaborating with groups like TechSoup. And you talk about, you mentioned some other household names, on this podcast, like the Candids or the Global Giving or the Everys. But how do we all work together to really try to advance in a cohesive way to this North Star that you're, highlighting the challenges of?
Yeah. I think there are a couple things. I think the National Council of Nonprofits is doing tremendous work. And right now, all their advocacy is focused on litigation and holding open the space in which civil society organizations can operate in. Now, I think we have tremendous work from organizations like Independent Sector and Council on Foundations and the Technology Affinity Group, TAG, and Wings, and that are supporting the sector as a whole and philanthropy serving organizations as a whole. And, really thinking about, what I geekily think of as the philanthropic supply chain. How are we getting goods and resources to the people that work in these nonprofit organizations so that they can invest in themselves, whether that's salary or whether it's tech infrastructure or whether that's a building, and that investment plays out with their community, right? And so we you know, definitely see all of that. And certainly, I think that the, work that some of the work independent sector does to make, to understand better and Urban Institute to understand better the nonprofit workforce and what it needs is one set of activity. But I think there's this other thing that we can learn from union organizing. It's really spelled out in a book called Mutualism by a woman whose name I'm going to forget, but I will look up whenever I have a minute. But a book called Mutualism. Sarah Hawkins? No,
I am Sarah Horowitz.
Sarah Horowitz. It is a terrific book because she started the Brooklyn Freelancers Union. It's also how do we band together as nonprofits and advocate for ourselves
Yes.
You talked about that that's historically part of what TechSoup has done. When I've been sitting across the table from these corporations or my colleagues in the organization are sitting across the table for these corporations, we're asking for donations or discounts for the entire sector, right? And so how do we continue to do that in this changing environment? Is it as donations, corporate donations, the dynamics of software as a service has meant many corporations have had to convert their philanthropy from donations to discounts because there's a real ongoing cost of goods for software as a service, right? And so when you have very generous givers can't tip themselves over with the gifts. So the donations help the discounts make sure that cost of goods is covered. So as you start moving there, is there an opportunity to aggregate the demand so we can say to those companies, oh, guess what? We represent a $3.5 million annual account, right? And we're not asking for anything special, actually. We're asking for what you give to any $3.5 million annual account. And what I'll worry about, it'll let it be my job to worry about how I distribute that across these nonprofits. But is there an opportunity for us to aggregate this demand in a way that we can actually leverage their regular for-profit mechanisms for the good of all these organizations? Are there ways that we could bring together all the organizations that we serve to do group buying and just use good old-fashioned procurement to lower the cost of goods? Because 100 printers are cheaper than, buying 100 printers at once, or is cheaper than buying one printer 100 times, And so there are
Hmm.
things like that that we can do. So I also mean from that mechanism, and it is what you see when you see groups like independent sector advocating for childcare credits because they know the tremendous benefit that that brings to nonprofit workers, or all the work that the National Council on Foundations is doing now to advocate for the sector as a whole. And so, how do we you know, what else can we be doing as intermediary organizations to provide that kind of support? And for us, some of that is developing tools like the one I was describing earlier, Shelter Ready, that we've done with San Diego County, that we've effectively lowered the cost of each of those organizations having a tool by working with the county to get something funded and building something that works for, a collective of organizations, not just one.
Thank you for sharing all of that. And this next question might be the right segue or not, but I wanted to acknowledge we were introduced by a mutual friend, Patrick from Tech Impact. And I know that you all are collaborating on the virtual CTO program. Can you talk about that and kind of in the
Yeah.
context of the mission at TechSoup and then also how it's evolved to today, 2025? Because I think that from my perspective, you're obviously TechSoup is at a completely different scale, the number of organizations you're serving. The entrepreneur in me finds it so interesting to be able to interact, have conversations, gather, even if it's anecdotal evidence before even hard data to understand what are the challenges that they're facing and then build that, right? And you all between TechSoup and Tech Impact are seeing so many organizations. What, how did this virtual CTO program come to be and what challenges are you addressing?
Yeah, Tech Impact is a terrific organization, and the team there, I feel very privileged to call them colleagues and friends. And so that's, it's really wonderful to have an opportunity to work with somebody where you can get in the room, like Pat and I did in our office in San Francisco, and say, okay, these small organizations that are under 2 million bucks, they can't afford managed IT services, they can't afford a consultant, they can't afford these things. So how are we going to help them? Because we don't want to leave them out, we don't wanna leave them out, and so together, we were saying, "Okay, what do you have, Tech Impact? What do we have, TechSoup? And how do we put that together to offer a CTO-like service to these organizations?" Now, it's not a fractional CTO. It's not like, my pal Michael Eno shows up in their organization for 3 hours a week to give them advice, But what it is saying, "Okay, we know this is the kind of guidance and advice a CTO gives. We know nonprofits are struggling to patch that together in the way that I was saying earlier. So how do we put that together as an affordable program where the nonprofits are paying 400 bucks a year and they're getting that kind of guidance and support? And how are we using community as a way of lowering and our scale combined and our combined expertise with tech impact as a way of lowering the cost of delivery. So if it costs me $100 to spend 1 hour of time with a nonprofit organization, can I aggregate a bunch of nonprofit organizations so it's still
Mhm.
1 hour? Can I tap into the goodwill of the corporations that we work with to bring some volunteer buddies with me? So if I have a nonprofit that's thinking about how do I use Box and their classification system and their e-signing tool, my nonprofit that serves foster youth, can I bring together 10 of those organizations, 3 Box volunteers, so that we can provide them that kind of guidance and scale it in those ways, right? We're experimenting with it. We sat in a room, both got super enthusiastic about it. We announced it. We did a light amount of marketing with a couple hundred interested organizations at this point, and we're going to deliver it to them and we're going to learn a lot. We're going to learn about the things that they need that can't get covered with that cost. Because just like you think about the CTO for a big company, they're not doing the company's website, they're not providing the help desk support. So those needs, how are we going to meet those needs when we run into them? Is community going to be sufficient or are we going to need other mechanisms? We want to invite funders in. I mean, we were so lucky to be working with a company like Okta, both of us as funders, with whom we have a great and trusted relationship. We were able to go back and say, hey, is it okay if we bend a portion of the grant you already gave us to cover this? And they said, absolutely, and that's the kind of innovation they wanted to see from trusted partners. So we were super lucky. We want to invite other funders in, to help support this effort and support the other things that organizations need. So I really would love to develop something that lets us give these organizations mini grants, effectively mini grants in a variety of ways so that they can pay for some of the stuff they need, because all the community in the world isn't going to help you if what you need is a new laptop. And we're
Mhm.
doing a survey right now to say, if you had $2,000, how would you use it? And hardware is top on the list. Number 2 is website design and communications. And that's inside, right? I'm peeking at the results before the survey is all the way done and it's public. It's, you know, I can be as like consultative as I want to be or use as much community as I want. That doesn't help their laptop problem. So what are we doing to support that? Group buying could support that. Mini grants could support that. But I think what this will do is let us uncover the next set of problems. That's what we always have to be working on. How do we solve something? Our team works super hard and we put together what it means to access technology donations and discounts. And now others can step into that market we created. All right. Let's use our nonprofit status and our commitment to our mission and not profit to run towards the next hard problem and work on that. And I think this is what the next hard problem is.
I'm so glad I can and I would love to do a whole series with you because this has been one of the more fascinating
It's very
episodes that I've had, I'm extremely grateful because I've gotten the opportunity to just sit here and be like a sponge and absorb a lot of this.
thank
What
you for that.
what I love with the anecdote that you just shared, Marnie, is not only specifically what you're doing there, but the mindset, right? Because TechSoup started many decades ago and it has continued to evolve and adapt, right? I mean, and I think that that is really, as I even think about my business and what are ways to continue to grow, it's all about figuring out. It's obviously been cited so many times over, but a lot of people will say that Wayne Gretzky was the greatest hockey player because he skated to where the puck was going, not where it was, right? And when I think about other business leaders like the Tony Robbins of the world, they talk about always being focused on constantly figuring out ways to love your customers and create new value and add more value. The world's changing. TechSoup, literally in the name, technology, at its core is always changing. So, can you just talk about if you think about TechSoup, both from its founding, but also maybe it's carried through the board with an organization like a TechSoup? And now I'm kind of going on, but I also think about and there's a lot of literature on this, right? Of why organizations and companies go out of business or go extinct. Or you think about even a decade ago or a couple of decades ago, certain companies that were the absolute dominant, and then they got lazy or they didn't innovate or they missed the opportunity and some other organization came in and now is owning the new market, so to speak. So, what are the philosophies and kind of the culture? Like, what's driving it at TechSoup, and how would you kind of round out this episode of advice to these 95% of organizations that are under a million in revenue?
So I think one of the things that nonprofits do, especially the small ones, that I just admire so much, they rise to meet the need. You have a fire in your community, you don't have organizations saying, well, I'm not a disaster response organization. I'm not going to help them. When Russia invaded Ukraine and people flooded across the borders into Poland, you didn't have an organization going, I'm a youth football club. I'm not going to help those other kids. I'm not a refugee serving organization. No, people turn up to meet the need in their local communities. And these small organizations are so agile at being able to do that. We just did some data analysis on organizations that we work with and found that we work with 100 animal shelters that also give food to pet owners because they realize that helps them keep the animals because
Mm,
the humans needed the food.
mm,
Were making choices, right? And
yes.
they didn't say, "We're not a food bank for people, we're a dog shelter." No, they stepped in and met that need. So I think what you're describing, that change in meeting the need, is the ethos of nonprofit
Mm,
organizations. I don't think it's anything special that we do. I think it's something special the sector does.
mm.
And these mission-driven people, because you have people started things because a gap existed and they stepped into that gap, and they
You
did it
know,
nonprofit
Marnie,
business.
I got to interrupt and just say that you completely opened my mind, which I want to seek out those opportunities to learn. And it's not always that it happens. You talked about, in the for profit world, moats, and in the nonprofit world, it should be bridges. Something that I've said over and over again that's always stuck with me, but you've really challenged. I was thinking about a lot during this interview. When I was starting Charity Charge, I had a friendly mentor, a woman, Catherine Engelhart Kronk. She was really the pioneer in case management software for nonprofit organizations and had an extremely successful software company that that did extremely well in the space, made a lot of impact and economically did really well. And she told me, "Hey, most nonprofits are generally 10 years behind in adopting new technologies and processes." And that point always stuck with me. And we could say, hey, maybe there's some truth to there, et cetera. But I've always kind of looked at it from that mindset. And what you just shared, because I think is like the essence of continuing to stay relevant, is addressing the need, being adaptable, being flexible, skating to where the puck's going. It made me really realize that there is so much that also the for profit world can learn from nonprofits. And it's not just the other way around, which for me is helping me even think about my just a whole new paradigm shift. So I thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I think it's an amazing sector, and I think a diverse, pluralistic nonprofit sector is vital if we want our community members to have the opportunities to thrive in ways that may be outside of the dominant culture and economics of a place.
Awesome. Well, I want to round out this episode by thanking you, Marnie,
Thank you.
for being on here from TechSoup. I think what you're doing, TechSoup.org, for anyone listening here, should go and check it out. It's really incredible, obviously, the scale and the impact. But if you're listening to this, you're involved in any way, shape, form with a nonprofit organization, I highly encourage you to go to TechSoup.org, find all the valuable products, services, training, resources that they're offering. Thank you so much for tuning in.